have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled Continuity of Agenda. Trump administration whitewashes Bush, Obama, Biden-backed Al-Qaeda in Syria. And of course, President Trump, during his first administration, also supported Al-Qaeda in Syria and ISIS. And I will get to all of that here as I read through this article. As I always do, I will read the article. I will add additional information when and if necessary. And I will show you all of the sources that I cited while writing this article. So let us begin. U.S. President Donald Trump announced during his May 2025 trip to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, that the U.S. would be lifting long-standing sanctions on Syria, Reuters reported. So that is right here. Trump says U.S. to lift Syria sanctions, secures $600 billion Saudi deal. Reuters would claim the end of sanctions on Syria would be a huge boost for a country that has been shattered by more than a decade of civil war. Rebels led by current President Ahmed al-Shara toppled President Bashar al-Assad last December. That is completely untrue. There was no civil war. And even though he's the alleged leader of these armed groups were created and directed by the U.S. and its regional proxies, including Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other Persian Gulf states. During this same trip, President Trump would also meet and shake hands with the current Syrian president, Ahmed al-Shara, also known as Abu Mohammed al-Jalani, who, before taking power, headed the still U.S. State Department designated foreign terrorist organization Al-Nusra Front, now referred to as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. So he is the leader of a U.S. designated terrorist organization, is still on the U.S. State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations. Right here, it was designated on May 15, 2014. That is the name of al-Jalani or al-Shara's Al-Nusra, ANF, HTS, essentially Al-Qaeda in Syria. That's what he was the head of. He had a $10 million bounty on his head by the US government. It was only just recently taken off, and now President Trump is shaking hands with him. But again, whether it was President Donald Trump who won the last US election or it was Kamala Harris, they both would have met with him. They both would have whitewashed him, the militants that the US backed in overthrowing the Syrian government, and they would have all lifted sanctions off of Syria. That was always the plan. That's why the headline of the article starts with continuity of agenda. In reality, the conflict in Syria was not a civil war, but rather a proxy war waged by the US alongside its Persian Gulf allies, Turkey and Israel, against the Syrian Arab Republic. The US sanctions President Trump is now lifting were designed to cripple the Syrian government, economy, and military, prevent reconstruction and economic recovery, and devastate the civilian population, all to hollow out the Syrian state, to precipitate its eventual collapse, as former U.S. Department of Defense official Dana Stroll stated publicly in 2019. I know I've showed this video many times. I'm going to show it to you again. This is a former U.S. Department of Defense official, Dana Stroll. This is what she said about Syria.
We argued in our recommendation section that taken as a whole, even though the United States said there's limited appetite domestically here or on the Hill to match the level of resources or even diplomatic investment of the Iranians and the Russians in Syria, that the United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified four. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were three other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime. This is, in our assessment, one of Russia's goals in the Middle East is the propaganda win for Russia of rehabilitating Assad on the international stage, of basically forcing the international community to normalize him and welcome him back in without any behavioral changes. So holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. Two is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. And three was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. And there was some stabilization assistance in the part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
So the plan of these sanctions, the plan of blocking reconstruction, was to precipitate the complete collapse of Syria, to allow these terrorists that the US was arming and backing to overrun the entire country. I constantly warn that even though the US seems to be in irreversible decline, its military powers being matched or exceeded by nations like Russia and China, they still possess tremendous asymmetric capabilities, politically capturing and controlling nations, politically undermining, subverting, and destroying nations. This is still something they're very good at, and the rest of the world is very bad at defending against. The US proxy war included a US-led campaign training, funding, equipping, and arming a network of extremists, including al-Shara al-Jalani's terrorist al-Nusra HTS. Throughout the conflict in Syria, even US-based publications like the New York Times admitted as early as 2012, the US Central Intelligence Agency was facilitating the flow of billions of dollars in weapons, ammunition, and equipment from Turkey to Syria. Right here. I've cited this article in hundreds of articles that I have written on Syria, the US proxy war on Syria, since it was published in 2012. I remember when this was published, and I have covered this many, many times. And it admits that it was the CIA overseeing all of the weapons, equipment, flowing across the borders into Syria to facilitate this proxy war against the central government the US openly sought to overthrow. While the official narrative was the US was arming moderate rebels, no explanation was ever given as to how or why terrorist organizations like al-Nusra, HTS, quickly ended up dominating the Western-backed militancy. If the US and its allies were providing billions in aid to moderate rebels, who was providing even greater amounts of aid to extremist organizations, allowing them to dominate the US-backed proxy war in Syria? How is that possible? The answer is simple. There were never any moderate rebels. The US planned years before the conflict ever began to use extremists as proxies to overthrow governments across the region, including Syria's. Here's another article that I have referenced many, many times. This was published in 2007, so years before the Arab Spring began and the US began overthrowing all of these countries, the US having organized the Arab Spring to begin with. This is the redirection by Seymour Hersh, and it very explicitly says to undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shia, the Bush administration, so we're talking about the Bush Jr. administration, this is how far back it goes, has decided in effect to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shia organization that is backed by Iran. The US has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. But they are hostile to America only in the most superficial way. They are created, armed, and backed by the US. This is why people have to do much deeper analysis. Follow the money and the weapons. Don't just listen to rhetoric and make up your mind. Follow the money. Who's really behind these organizations? You can create an organization that looks opposed to you, to create distance between yourself and the organization, all the horrible things that it does, as Al-Qaeda has done for decades now. Horrible, horrible things the US would like to distance itself from, even though all of the money, all of the weapons, everything was deliberately handed over to them, laundered through the US's regional proxies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Turkey. But these were militants the US created and used deliberately. Preparations to build up militant groups as well as their political wings, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, were already ongoing when Hersh wrote his 2007 article and continued until the US engineered Arab Spring unfolded in 2011 under the Obama administration. Many people say, Brian, the Arab Spring was legitimate. Millions of people just spontaneously all came out of their houses at the same time and organized and to overthrow their governments. This is totally organic. That's not how protests work. And the US even eventually admitted that it funded all of it. And if you do the actual research and you looked up all the organizations that were leading these mobs in the streets, you can see all of the evidence of US government funding for them years before it all started. I did the research. I have presented it for many years. All the NED money, there were seminars the leaders of these opposition groups attended years before the Arab Spring began, training them to go back to their home country and overthrow it years later. So this is what the New York Times, in this 2011 article, US groups help nurture Arab uprising. So it doesn't get more obvious than that. A number of groups and individuals directly involved in the revolts and reforms sweeping the region received training and financing from groups like the International Republic Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House, a nonprofit human rights organization based in Washington, according to interviews in recent weeks, and American diplomatic cables obtained by WikiLeaks. Thank goodness for WikiLeaks. They exposed all of it, and they forced the US to deal with this reality that they were involved in all of this. The same article also admitted the Republican and Democratic institutes are loosely affiliated with the Republican and Democratic parties. They were created by Congress and are financed through the National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up in 1983 to channel grants for promoting democracy in developing nations. The National Endowment receives about $100 million annually from Congress. Freedom House also gets the bulk of its money from the American government, mainly from the State Department. So these are not non-governmental organizations. They are US government organizations used to carry out political interference worldwide, including up to and all throughout the Arab Spring. That was a US-engineered reorganization of the entire region. The chaos the US-engineered Arab Spring created was used as an opportunity to launch multiple wars and proxy wars across the region, including a NATO-led regime change operation against Libya and North Africa, US-backed Saudi-led coalition targeting Ansar Allah in Yemen, and the US proxy war in Syria, which eventually involved the US invasion and occupation of eastern Syria, while NATO member Turkey invaded and occupied its northern regions. Throughout the first Trump administration, 2017 to 2021, brutal US sanctions and the illegal occupation of Syrian territory, which began under the Obama administration, were continued or even expanded. While many supporters of President Trump have attempted to claim his administration wanted to withdraw US forces from Syria, the Trump administration repeatedly and eagerly launched military strikes across Syria and carried out attacks on Syria's ally Iran, including the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, who at the time was in fact waging a regional war against US-backed terrorist organizations, including and especially Al-Nusra HTS and the self-proclaimed Islamic State, also known as ISIS, as even US government-funded media PBS admitted at the time. We've got this article here. Qasem Soleimani's complex legacy in Iraq. It has to be complex, because if they just admitted it and told you that he was there fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the US killed him because he was doing a good job of it and the US was actually behind ISIS and Al-Qaeda, that would be a little too easy for people to understand, and that it would be easy for people to decide whether or not to continue supporting US foreign policy. And of course, they would decide not to. if they knew the truth. Thus, President Trump lifting U.S. sanctions on Syria now that U.S.-backed terrorists have succeeded in Washington's goal of overthrowing the Syrian government is simply the next step in what was clearly continuity of agenda, allowing U.S.-backed proxies to consolidate control over Syria and prepare it as a springboard for wider regional violence aimed at Iran and what remains of its network of allies and partners. Just like they did with Libya. Once they overthrew Libya, they used it as a springboard to send all of those fighters, all of those weapons to Syria, but also to other places in North Africa to destabilize and destroy everything, and to create a constant pretext for US AFRICOM to remain engaged on the continent. Let's continue. While Al-Nusra HTS remains a U.S. State Department designated foreign terrorist organization at the time of this writing, if history can serve as a guide, attempts will be made to delist it, allowing the U.S. to more overtly aid it as Washington's confrontation with Iran continues. A similar process took place during the U.S.-led NATO war in Libya. The U.S. had likewise armed and backed the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. So if Al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda in Syria, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group is Al-Qaeda in Libya. So it was backing the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, even though it was also listed on the foreign terrorist organization. Let's see if we can find it on the list. So under delisted foreign terrorist organizations, there's the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Let's see. Libyan Islamic Fighting Group remained on the U.S. State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations till long after the successful overthrow of the Libyan government. Despite providing weapons, training, equipment, and even air cover for the organization, the U.S. sought to maintain plausible deniability as the terrorist organization committed ethnic and religious-driven atrocities all throughout and immediately after the conflict. In late 2015, the organization was officially delisted by the U.S. State Department, even as the organization and its members continued carrying out terrorism, not only across the Arab world, but within the borders of its Western sponsors, including the 2017 Manchester attack in the United Kingdom, the BBC reported. Do you remember the Manchester attack? Right here, the BBC, the Libyan Jihad Connection. Who was it? The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. That was the organization, the terrorists who carried out the attack were drawn from. And the UK participated in the war on Libya, and they supported the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, just like they supported Al-Qaeda alongside the US everywhere across the region. And they brought these extremists back to the UK. They knew who they were and how dangerous they were. And they essentially, by not immediately detaining them, they allowed these attacks to take place. And then what does that do at home? That allows the British and the American governments to divide their public, cultivate extremism on one hand, Islamophobia and racism on the other hand. They got everybody divided and distracted against one another. Nobody decides to cooperate together to deal with the government, which is the actual problem. U.S. President Donald Trump ran for office both in 2017 and 2024 on the promise of draining the swamp and fighting against the deep state. During his first administration and now continuing throughout his second administration, he has instead demonstrably played his role in continuing all of the policies of the deep state. Just as was the case throughout the Bush, Obama, and Biden administrations, President Trump will continue overseeing the use of extremist groups to advance U.S. foreign policy objectives around the globe, including in the Middle East, and specifically against the nation of Iran. President Trump's lifting of sanctions on Syria and his normalization of the leader of a still U.S.-listed terrorist organization demonstrates the vast disparity between President Trump's rhetoric and the reality of what his administration is actually doing. The world should have learned by now that holding its breath and waiting for the United States to end continuity of agenda on its own is a dangerous, irresponsible fantasy, and only through cooperation and concerted effort can the global system the U.S. draws its power from be displaced and then replaced, and the rise of multipolarism used to secure nations and regions around the world from the decades-spanning interference and aggression of the United States government and the corporate financier interests determining its policies, no matter who sits in the White House. Those seeking comfort in the delusion that President Trump represents change are betrayed by President Trump's own words, actions, and policies, as its administration clearly is picking up right where the Biden administration and others left off. And I would like to hear the excuses and explanations and rationalizations of why President Trump is shaking hands with the leader of a US-listed terrorist organization, why he is authorizing the bombing of Yemen, arming and aiding Israel and bombing Gaza and Lebanon, but not dropping a bomb on al-Jawlani's head, the head of a US-listed terrorist organization. Instead, he's shaking hands with him. What is the justification for that? People might argue, well, Russia is there normalizing the new supposed government of Syria. Russia lost. That was a proxy war. Russia was trying to prop up the Syrian government. The US was trying to destroy it. The US won. Russia has no more cards to play in Syria. They have no choice but to go along with what's happening right now until things change and they have an opportunity to change things for the better. The US created this problem. President Trump presided over this for 4 years during his first term, and now he's picking up right where he and the Biden administration left off last. That is the big difference. Explain to me what excuse, justification, or rationalization there is for President Trump to be doing this versus all of the things he claimed he was going to do coming into office. He can stand up to all of these other aspects of the so-called deep state, but he can't call out al-Jawlani as a terrorist? Are you going to say he did this because he needed this $600 billion deal with Saudi Arabia? So then what does this say about American principles? What does this say about President Trump's own personal principles? And how reliable of a person does that make him? So there's a lot of problems and paradoxes and conundrums. So I really wonder what supporters of President Trump are going to say to excuse or rationalize or justify his role in continuing this policy in the Middle East, which is continuity of agenda. And who is pushing this agenda forward? It is the so-called deep state, these unelected corporates and financier interests that drive foreign and domestic policy for the US at the cost of absolutely everyone else, including the American people, for their own benefit. President Trump is helping this along. Why? Why is he doing that? Should make people stop and think and question what they think they believe, what they think they know, and what the truth may actually be. They may have just been lied to again by another politician in Washington. Politicians in Washington who do nothing but lie. I'm going to leave it there for now. We have to keep a close eye on the Middle East. The conflict in the Middle East is not happening in isolation. It is interconnected with the US proxy war on Russia and Ukraine, and this confrontation between the US and China in the Asia Pacific, the US encroaching upon China and confronting China within China's own borders. It's all interconnected. The flow of hydrocarbons from the Middle East to China, if that were disrupted, would deal a severe blow to the Chinese economy. The US knows this, and they are setting the stage to achieve that, to deliver that blow. So you have to keep a close eye on all of this. We cannot become myopically obsessed with one conflict over the other. We do need to see how they're interconnected and the bigger picture all of this shapes up into. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for all the places you can find and follow my work. All of the references that I cited are listed down there, as well as the New Eastern Outlook article that I was just reading. Also in the video description are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of the other platforms that I am on. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. To everyone who is helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you don't have any resources to spare and you're just sharing my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. All of that helps make this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.